I'll begin with a brief teaser that bridges the earlier period discussed in this study day and the late 17th century. This is a tale of a famous Jacobean playhouse tune, Ariel's Where the Bee Sucks by Robert Johnson, and its restoration afterlife. Ariel's song was printed decades after its first performance in John Wilson's Cheerful Airs of 1659. The version found in Cheerful Airs does not capture Ariel's song as heard in Shakespeare's theater. Like the other songs in this volume, they have been arranged so they might be sung recreationally with others. Thus, Ariel's voice in Wilson's publication is a polyphonic one, cantus primus, secundus, bassus, and unfigured bass. The cantus 1 and the unfigured bass were printed together, so if the purchaser wanted to perform as a solo Ariel, he or she could do so, either a cappella or with keyboard, lute, or other accompaniment. The cantus 2 and bassus part book were bound separately. A manuscript of Where the Bee Sucks transcribes the treble and bass as found in Cheerful Airs. Edward Lowe made this copy in the late 17th century. A composer, organist, and prolific copyist, Lowe had taken the post of professor of music at Oxford after his friend Wilson relinquished the position to him in 1661. The manuscript bears some marks of recreational use and modification, including 3 additional stanzas to Where the Bee Sucks. These supposed to be made by Mr. Smith, secretary to the Archbishop of Canterbury. On the left-hand side of the page is a note, "This I had of Madame Trumbull at Chalfont, 27th September, 1676. Lowe, Smith, and Trumbull were near neighbors. Thus, these manuscripts may preserve a musical interaction among friends. More tantalizingly, it indicates female musical participation in a mixed-gender domestic setting. Madame Trumbull was presumably the wife of the vicar of Witney, Ralph Trumbull. Although Smith apparently made or wrote the additional stanzas, it was Madame Trumbull who seems to have circulated them to Lowe. This manuscript, then, bears the traces of a collaborative reshaping of Ariel's voice by men and women. As we shall see, what holds true for Where the Bee Sucks also holds true throughout the Restoration period, as eager consumers purchased printed music or copied playhouse tunes into manuscripts for personal use, sometimes with a difference. My paper first examines the class status of these recreational singers and the interpretive differences between performing in the theater and the domicile, before turning my attention to 2 case studies as I trace the journey of 2 songs from stage to page to recreational performance. Archival sources, printed in manuscript, might not tell us everything, as we've already heard today, but they can reveal a great deal about how people engaged with playhouse tunes. Theater lovers in late 17th century London could attend the playhouse, enjoy the singing and acting of their favorite performers, and then procure a copy of these songs for future use. They might even, as Edward Lowe and his collaborators did, make further arrangements and modifications to suit their own performance needs. But these activities were not open to all, and singing served a very different purpose in the domicile than on stage. These at-home consumers were not celebrities, and their performances were not for sale. They were not performing songs as part of a dramatic entertainment, and their music making was part of a domestic sociable practice. That isn't to say that elements of theatrical performance didn't bleed into the domestic space. Indeed, as I shall explore, recreational performances of playhouse tunes were haunted by the ghosts of their professional antecedents, the specters of the singers, actors, or actresses who originated the role, who first sang the song. Some playhouse tunes circulated without notation, entering the public imagination largely through oral transmission. In this form, these songs were accessible to a wide, non-musically literate audience. For instance, Purcell's "If Love's a Sweet Passion" from the dramatic opera The Fairy Queen was so well known that it became a popular ballad tune. For the most part, the recreational performers of notated playhouse songs belonged to a rarefied stratum of society, a stratum that was musically literate, had the disposable income to purchase paper to make copies of their favorite tunes, and or who had sufficient wealth to purchase printed songbooks. Robert Hume has argued that, quote, no more than 5% of the total population of England and Wales could have had the discretionary spending capacity to indulge significantly in such activities, a point further corroborated by Stephanie Carter in her research on Restoration print culture. Thus, given the disposable income and musical expertise needed to perform notated playhouse tunes at home, it may be hyperbole to claim their ubiquity. Sorry, for the purposes of this study day. In what follows, I consider the tangled relationship between theatrical and domestic performance as revealed in printed and manuscript sources for two of John Eccles' most popular pieces, I Burn from Thomas Durfey's Don Quixote of Part 2, which was performed in 1694, and As Cupid Roguishly One Day from Charles Boyle's Altamira of 1701. I consider how these circulating material objects served as conduits between theater and domicile, as prompts for new performances by recreational musicians. I focus on John Eccles, for he was one of the most popular composers of his day and thus held a prominent place in the burgeoning London musical market. We've already heard a little bit about him in Sarah's wonderful paper. His prominence was second only to Henry Purcell, with whom he briefly worked in 1693 to 95. During these few years, both Purcell and Eccles composed music for the United Company, the theater troupe that resulted from the merger in 1682 of the two patent companies, the Dukes and the Kings. Judging from contemporary reports, Eccles' music often surpassed Purcell's in its crowd-pleasing qualities. Although he also wrote for professional singers, Eccles spent most of his time composing for actor singers, expertly devising music that suited their talents. Eccles gave them the space to add in their own expression, which made his songs tremendously effective in the theater, even if they do not always reward modern musicologists keen on analysis. One rarely finds daring chromaticism or adventurous counterpoint, but Eccles was writing to be accessible, both for his actor singers, who sometimes possessed more modest abilities than the professional musicians, and his audiences. The printed and manuscript sources that survive reveal how people engaged with Eccles' music and the marketplace in which they circulated. The market for printed music exploded in late 17th century England because of the expiration of the Press Act in 1695, which ended censorship and the monopoly of the Stationers' Company. Would-be music publishers no longer needed to publish under the company's license, which allowed for more competition. In this marketplace, Eccles printed theater songs after 1695, and even before it in some cases, appeared in many forms. Like the songs of his contemporaries, his playhouse songs were arranged for domestic use, appearing in collections and as much cheaper single song sheets. Vocal parts were usually notated in treble clef, regardless of the range of the original playhouse singer, and string parts were often omitted, facilitating performance at the keyboard and also reducing printing costs, making the sheets more affordable to consumers. Flute recorder arrangements were sometimes provided as well, providing flexible performance options. Recreational musicians who compiled manuscripts of Eccles' music frequently used printed copies as their sources, although they sometimes adapted it for different instruments or introduced variants, reshaping the music to suit their own ends. One of Eccles' most profound and sustained collaborations was with the actress Anne Bracegirdle, who sang his music exclusively. He shaped his songs to suit her specific musical and dramatic talents, and she made his music famous through her expert interpretations. Their most famous collaboration was I Burn from Thomas Durfee's play Don Quixote Part 2. Bracegirdle made a huge impression singing the role of Marcella, a woman driven mad by unrequited love. This song was one of the great hit tunes of the late 17th century, and both Henry Purcell and Gottfried Finger wrote musical responses to Bracegirdle's performance, which were then purveyed to at-home consumers, further stoking interest in her and her considerable talents. There are 7 surviving printed versions and 3 manuscript sources from the late 17th and early 18th centuries of I Burn, and most of the printed versions use Bracegirdle's celebrity as a selling point. The song was first issued in the collection, The Songs to the New Play of Don Quixote, Part the Second, a publication that capitalized on the success of the play, enticing potential consumers to purchase the music to perform at home, just as consumers today might purchase a songbook from their favorite musical. Designed for domestic consumption, the printed songbook version of I Burn provided a souvenir of the famous actress-singer's performance, allowing at-home performers the ability to recall when she sang the piece in the comedy, the 7th song in the last act. Contemporary printers and engravers regularly pirated material from each other, and in this case, Thomas Cross and John Walsh produced their own versions of I Burn that are almost identical to the 1694 version. Cross even copied the irregular spelling of Anne Bracegirdle's name, and you can see that here. Cross was an interesting figure in the London musical world, for he was the first to print single song sheets, which allowed for the quick and relatively cheap dissemination of the most popular songs. When Cross wasn't pirating the work of others, as he did with I Burn, or more rarely getting the song directly from the composer, the engraver may have relied on informants in the theater for the music, actors, singers, impresarios, or other theater personnel. Based on the presence of ornaments, unique variants, and other elements, Rebecca Harrison has recently argued that Cross's song sheets, though corrupt, may have captured something of the way the songs were performed in the theater, which in turn allowed the amateur singer to recreate what they heard on stage at home. Cross's engraved single sheet editions are not the only ones, however, that might have recorded elements of theatrical performance for the at-home market. A unique version of I Burn is found in John Eccles' Omnibus, a collection of songs of 1704, printed by John Walsh. This edition, produced under the composer's supervision, carefully notes tempo changes in the score, possibly documenting how Eccles' close collaborator Bracegirdle performed the Mad Song. Such tempo markings allowed recreational musicians to replicate an effective performance of theatrical madness, for, as Bruce R. Smith has noted, musical scores are somatic. They tell a body and voice what to do. Thus, we might view this score of I Burn as a map that allowed amateurs to retrace Bracegirdle's particular performative steps. The manuscript copies of I Burn from the late 17th and early 18th centuries also reveal something of the ways domestic performers reshaped their source texts. These manuscripts were almost always copied from printed song sheets or collections. Several of them, for example, British Library Additional Manuscript 22099 and 35043, have unique but small variants, such as differences in rhythmic patterns and melodic ornamentation, octave displacements in the continuo part, and differences in figuration, what Alan Howard has usefully called background variation. This background variation, as Rebecca Harrison has noted, would not have been considered ontologically significant in the 17th and early 18th centuries, for, as she puts it, these variants seem to represent alternative realizations of what would have been regarded at the time as fundamentally the same music. Thus, it is most appropriate to view background variation as evidence of engagement rather than arrangement. Other manuscripts draw upon multiple printed sources in bricolage fashion, taking what they need from each and making corrections when they find errors in the source material. One early 18th century manuscript copy of I Burn, housed at the Library of Congress, does precisely this. The copyist clearly had access to the version found in Eccles' songbook, as well as the 1694 version, and he or she frequently incorporated readings from both sources. Sometimes he or she wrote in variant readings from these two sources alongside each other. You can see that here. The copyist may have also had access to the same copy used by the scribe of the aforementioned British Library Additional Manuscript 22099. That's one of these manuscripts that has the background variation. For these two sources share one small unique variant in common. It is entirely possible that such variants derive from other now lost sources for I Burn, I Burn. In 1695, the actors Thomas Betterton, Elizabeth Barry, Bracegirdle, and others left to form their own company at Lincoln's Inn Fields, and Eccles joined them as their primary house composer. One of Eccles' most popular songs during this period was As Cupid Roguishly One Day from Charles Boyle's Altamira of 1701. As Cupid Roguishly One Day was used for an utterly conventional dramatic situation. On-stage musicians often performed songs for lovesick men that commented on their tortured emotional state. In this case, the lovesick altamast languished on the ground as professional soprano Mary Baldwin sang of the power of Cupid. The extant sources for As Cupid reveal different facets of the domestic music market than I Burn, I Burn. Mistress Baldwin was not a marketable commodity like Anne Bracegirdle. While 5 out of the 10 extant sources for I Burn use a variation of the Sung by Bracegirdle rubric in their title, only one copy as Cupid mentions a performer, the copy found in Eccles' 1704 songbook collection. The rest only list the composer, John Eccles. Unlike I Burn, the first printed example of As Cupid comes from the engraver Thomas Cross. Many of the extant printed and manuscript sources are derived from it, and Cross's song sheet may be closer to what Mary Baldwin sang in the theater. However, there is a problem with the version in Cross's song sheet for an at-home performer, a problem that Eccles corrected in his 1704 collection. Alan Howard has shown that Eccles' songbook frequently clarifies notation and corrects errors found in other sources. As we can see here, the repeat is ambiguous in the Cross sheet, so the performer would assume that they had to repeat the whole 50-bar duple time section at the end of the song, as nothing more specific is indicated. In the 1704 collection, the repeat is clearly marked. An additional source for As Cupid provides further evidence of its reception and use among recreational performers. As Cupid is included in Durfee's popular series Pills to Purge Melancholy, which was published between 1698 and 1720. The songs in Pills exist on a continuum of notational specificity. For some well-known tunes like I Burn, only the text was given. The slightly less well-known As Cupid is printed in the more typical fashion for the Pills collection. The untexted vocal part is given first, allowing for all manner of adaptation and arrangement at the will of the performer, and then the text. If an at-home performer wanted to sing this song, they would have to sort out the text underlay themselves, and the accompanist would need to supply harmonies that fit with the melody line. It also has additional verses not found elsewhere, like Ariel's song discussed at the beginning of this paper. I'd like to return briefly to Eccles' Omnibus 1704 collection to consider how it served amateur musicians. The composer, following a current trend, published a selection of his vocal music. Other similar examples are Frances Purcell's posthumous collection of her husband's music, Orpheus Britannicus, and John Blow's Amphion Anglicus. Published by subscription, possibly to recoup some of the printing costs, As we've seen, Eccles' songbook was an accurate and complete source, providing more extensive figuring and tempo markings and precise repeats to guide the at-home consumer. Consumers had to pay for this level of quality. Eccles' collection was very expensive. It cost 18 shillings. Beyond the prohibitive cost, Eccles' songbook had other drawbacks for the at-home consumer. It, and other songbooks like it, provided the recreational musician with a wide range of hit playhouse tunes, but such volumes were also large and potentially unwieldy to use. For this reason, recreational musicians often purchased songbooks as file copies and created individual manuscripts of their favorite songs for actual use. Sometimes they even collated variants from two printed sources, allowing them to choose their own adventure in performance, like the copyist of the Library of Congress manuscript. Another much cheaper alternative to the omnibus songbook was the single song sheets produced by Thomas Cross and those who followed him. These song sheets may have been error-ridden, but in the case of Cross, they may have preserved more of what happened in the playhouse because they were swiftly produced, potentially with insider knowledge. Cross's business model was so effective that others, such as John Walsh, the engraver of Eccles' collection, followed suit. Indeed, as Alan Howard will explore at greater length in a forthcoming Journal of Musicology article, many of the plates used in Eccles' collection were first issued by Walsh as single song sheets. Although these plates were corrected and modified in various ways, around 1/3 of Eccles' collection was compiled from previously released song sheets. Although the two songs I've considered in this paper are exceptions to the rule, as they are newly engraved plates with unique variants. As this brief consideration of the journey of two songs suggests, consumers had no compunction adapting playhouse tunes and engaging with them in a range of ways. Publishers sold multiple arrangements of these songs, and amateur performers eagerly modified them to suit their purposes, leaving enticing material traces of late 17th century recreational musicking. Thank you.